Let's spread the good word about mathematicians and what they've done for the world. Let me get my sword. Oh wait, no. I got something mightier. Mathematics is arguably the most useful tool humans have ever created. It's the factory in which humankind's geniuses have often dreamt up the abstract nuts and bolts that engineers then use to make absolutely formidable technologies. You know, the ones that function so well that we first worlders, at least, usually forget all about the suffering they keep at bay. At least until maybe a particularly bad day shows its ugly head, and the power goes out, your car engine maybe overheats, or maybe even the road you use every day gets flooded. Then we start to notice some of these technologies. We drip with sweat while we walk miles to a place we normally arrive at in minutes, cursing the damn cell reception for not giving us something to listen to along the way. Math is, it's critical to you and me. It's in a lot of things that you might not notice either. I mean, think about the building or car you're probably sitting in. Buildings don't exist without trigonometry or numeracy. Cars don't work without geometry of gears, for instance. TV, music, movies, they don't exist without compression algorithms. The internet doesn't function without scheduling and encryption algorithms. Computers, they don't do anything without Boolean algebra. To direct the billions of electrons pulsing through the semiconductor chips in our cell phones. That makes digital logic. And yeah, believe it or not, you can add and subtract ones and zeros and do it physically on a circuit board using gates that flip open and closed. The list, you know, is vast, but certainly not infinite. The point is that engineering, science, inventions, medicine, technology, they all need mathematics to exist. And, that's a satellite. by the way. But math it's so esoteric, it's so abstract, and literally a foreign language to so many people that sometimes the most uniquely genius humans in history rarely get a proper recognition for their contributions to humanity. And what I'm trying to roughly portray here, whoa, there's a tripod, is that radio waves, this is pretty crazy to think about. Literally, I'm using a phone right now to record this. And radio waves are something, the properties of which we use mathematics to describe very, very accurately, by the way. And our cell phones actually emit a bunch of radio waves, which a cell tower then catches and sends to a satellite in space. And then the satellites do whatever they do with the information and send it back to the local radio wave emitter on the network, and that gets picked up by the intended recipient, who picks it up because they have a unique address that this packet of ones and zeros, pulses and non-pulses, are being sent to. You know, everything from the ancient Egyptians using a measuring stick to build the pyramids. You know, man is the measure of all things. We relate things to the world according to how they relate to our bodies. We build things so that we can use them to manipulate the world and interact with each other, or avoid the harsh realities of the world, like weather. So, you know, math is the language we use to describe all these great, like, literally fantastic achievements that we've so far created and are continuing every day to create. So in honor of some of the greatest thinkers of mankind, I'm going to celebrate Euler today. Leonhard Euler, a Swiss mathematician, because he was one of the most prolific mathematicians to have ever lived. So Carl, I'm glad you suggested this video. Gave me a reason to look into some of the more fantastic mathematicians in the world. And I mean, there's many, and of course, the more you're familiar with the actual math, the more you can make an argument for the lack of a single greatest mathematician. But Euler was definitely up there in almost any list that gets made. So I want to just look at his life, and with any luck I can talk about some of his mathematics. I'd like to maybe make this a recurring series about the lives and works of the most famous scientists, mathematicians, philosophers, artists, anybody who's had a profound impact on how humans manipulate and view the world and how we live differently since they've existed. So let's find out how one of the most prolific mathematicians grew up, revolutionized our understanding of the universe and ultimately left us. Euler was a Swiss mathematician, physicist, astronomer, logician, and engineer, who, while primarily known for his important mathematical discoveries, was also known for his work in mechanics, fluid dynamics, optics, astronomy, and even music theory, a lot of which we'll get to later. Euler was one of the most eminent mathematicians of the 18th century, and maybe even the greatest in history. You know, he's also one of the most prolific mathematicians of all time. Trying to make some books here. His collected works fills 60 to 80 quarto volumes, which I think it was something like 380 articles published. It's pretty nuts. A statement attributed to Pierre-Simon Laplace, which many of you would know from his Laplace transforms, which are integral to understanding modern electrical engineering these days. So, integral to characterizing signals in systems that your cell phones and all modern electronics uses. So he's a credible guy to quote, and he expresses Euler's influence on mathematics as, quote, "Read Euler. Read Euler, he's the master of us all. The master of us all." Basically, read Euler and you'll know what most of humanity has learned up to this point. So that's quite a compliment. Quite a compliment. I'm pretty sure I was writing all that off camera right there, so sorry about that. So Euler was born in the early 1700s. Called that the 18th century, April 5th, 1707. Still somehow managing to write it out of frame. Sorry. In Basel, Switzerland. And this side note, interestingly, Switzerland, so if I draw it real quick, very, very, very rough drawing, looks something like this. Okay, right there. Let's see. Let's see, we got Germany. Let's see, yellow. Make our lines here. Let's see. We got Italy, Austria. Like that. So we got Austria. We got Italy. And, of course, France. Switzerland. It's home to an obscene number of Nobel Prize winners that include, let's see, physicists. We got, let's see, Pauli, Einstein. Then we got the Bernoullis. And we got Paul Bernays. Let's see, and then famous, artists, psychologists, philosophers, physicists, scientists, Jung, let's see, Binswanger, we got Jean Piaget, Rorschach, everybody knows. How do you spell that? S-C-H-A-C-H. And Paul Dirac, Dirac delta functions or something like that. This is really incredible, the list. So it's like, almost makes you ask, like, what's in the water there? When his father, Paul Euler, was a pastor, let's see if I can do this. And he was friends with some of the most famous mathematicians in the world at the time. Oh man, that doesn't look very impressive. That's supposed to be a prayer right there. And he's a happy kid because he comes from a relatively affluent, well, I would say just absolutely affluent family. His dad's friends with a family of mathematicians, the Bernoullis. But he himself is a pastor. So it's, from day one, he has an interesting mix of religion and logic, science, math. And you got the Bernoullis. So we have, God and the other type of God to some people, logic. And this is meant to be an addition symbol, trying to be funny here. So from day one you can see he's already instilled and probably inspired in the fortunate circumstance of being next to a godly man and a mathematical family. Euler's formal education started in Basel, where he was sent to live with his maternal grandmother. In 1720, at the age of 13 years old, he enrolled at the University of Basel. Famous school. Nietzsche, among many people, actually taught there. In 1723, at the age of 16, he received a master's of philosophy with a dissertation comparing Descartes with Newton, sorry. Those two names are so commonly juxtaposed. Descartes was famous, mathematically at least. He was a great, great philosopher, but he was also famous for defining a brilliant way to look at, to really visualize mathematics in the form of a Cartesian coordinate system. right there. And that's the common graph that everyone's taught in school. As you plot values along the x and y axis to make a function, And he compared the philosophies of Descartes and Newton. Newton here I'm just defining as an originator of the calculus, which was a huge revolutionary leap forward. And two huge mathematical giants right there. So, the integral is the area under the curve of an equation. If you have x squared, or if you have 2x, and you take the integral of that, that would be x squared. And that would be the area under the curve of 2x. In fact, so during that time he was receiving Saturday afternoon lessons from who but Johann Bernoulli. I mean, he's getting lessons. He's getting tutored. It would be like me getting tutored in physics by Richard Feynman or Stephen Hawking, But Bernoulli quickly discovered that, okay, Euler actually knows his stuff, and or at least has a great proclivity to learn mathematics. So from a young age he was encouraged to learn, and not only learn math though. His dad again was pulling him towards religion, so he was really a Renaissance guy, learning cutting edge math and science using the most advanced methods in calculus that the Bernoullis were in fact at the head of moving forward. And his dad was pushing him towards theology, a career as a priest. So he was learning Greek and Hebrew. So he was, Greek. I think it's pretty cool if you can read. It's something that a lot of privileged, I guess, people were taught. And that meant you could read ancient Greek and Hebrew. If you knew those, you could read the ancient texts, such as the Bible, Torah, and many foundational philosophical texts in Greek. So in Greek looks like the word God, for instance, looks like this. In Hebrew, hope I'm not being sacrosanct, it looks like this. Let's see if I can do this right. It's kind of like the letter pi right there. And that with a 7 and an N. So Euler had all this formal training at a young age, but luckily the Bernoullis convinced his father to, well, maybe not luckily, maybe he would have made a revolutionary change in our moralities and the way we looked at religion, but nonetheless fate would have it that his tutor, pretty much like me being taught physics by Einstein, pushed him, obviously, with his skill towards a career in mathematics. So he ultimately chose math. But either way, he was a brilliant mind, so it was good for the human race. Now, in 1726, Euler completed his a dissertation on the propagation of sound. And it's just crazy how many different areas Euler was proficient in, that he applied mathematics to. His treatise was called De Sono. De Sono. De Sono. At that time, he was unsuccessfully attempting to obtain a position at the University of Basel, which he graduated from at 13. So it was a lifetime ago that he had been there, but he wanted to go back. In 1727, he first entered the Paris Academy prize problem competition. The problem was, that year, the best way to place a mast on a ship. And this was an engineering problem that would, and I haven't taken mechanical engineering courses, but I know Euler is definitely a significant contributor to engineering in general based on this. So they could navigate much more efficiently now. So based on this, it got his feet wet with engineering, practical applications of his knowledge, his deep knowledge of math. And despite coming up with a genius solution to it, he still only took second place. But as a consolation prize, the man he took second place to became the father of naval engineering. So not a bad person to lose to. But you know, that didn't stop him. Euler ended up, let's see, he ended up entering this contest again and winning first. 12, not 10, not 11, but 12. 12 frickin' times. In the future. Brilliant guy. At only 20 years old, Euler moved now, after a pretty successful, pretty bright, promising future, to St. Petersburg, Russia. So, if we, the boot of Italy there, Greece, Mediterranean. He moved, I think it was, I looked up the number earlier, it was something like 2,500 kilometers away. And when I looked it up, it actually was on Google Maps, and it gave me 3 big warning signs. That was, what was it? There's tolls. There's multiple countries you're going to travel through, and if that didn't deter you, it's a different time zone. Sure you want to do this? But Euler did, and after Johann's son, Daniel Bernoulli, had recommended him for the post in physiology at the Imperial Russian Academy. So this move was made because of Johann, I think Jacob Bernoulli was the most famous Bernoulli, but Johann's son Daniel, Jacob Bernoulli's nephew, I think, had recommended Euler. He was already over at the Imperial. This is a significant part of Euler's life, so we'll go ahead and write this out. The Imperial Russian Academy. Don't want to misspell that word. Of Sciences. So Daniel was already over there, and so Euler had to connect. He was able to network and get in the post of all things, physiology. So he was in the university, the academy, rather. And this was actually a good move for him, as far as he thought, because at that time, the academy in St. Petersburg, which is actually, I drew it like this. Oh shit, where am I? I drew it like this because it's right near Finland. So it's not all the way into the depths of Asia. It's still relatively close to Europe, but also it came with a few benefits. It was established by Peter the Great, intended to improve education in Russia and to close the scientific gap between Western Europe and, Russia being kind of geographically distant. And so he had intended to initially even provide it. He was setting up a business model to really ramp up the research and the quality of science done there by attracting the greatest minds with the greatest benefits. He had ample funding and a heavy focus on research. So for Bernoulli and Euler then, this came with some great benefits and a heavy focus on research, which was actually, well, even today, it's a rarity to get that in the university. That's a very prestigious set of circumstances to have as a professor. I know most professors wish they could research full-time, but instead they have to break it up by lecturing up to students that sometimes don't want to hear them. So let's go ahead and draw this. Let's see. He's going to be pretty happy doing this, I would say. So he's really into it. He's got the tongue out there. Okay, so he instead of yelling, he's researching. I think that's how some professors might view it. Anyways, I remember seeing a graph that was like this, and let's see, it was like 95% lectures. It was on one of my one of my physics professor's doors. Let's see. 3% faculty meetings. And they were left with something like 2% research. And then, it essentially shook down like that. So, I thought that was pretty funny. But anyways, nice little detour there. So he's now in Russia, doing awesome work. Full-time researcher, pretty much, at, let's see, the age of 24. So eventually Daniel left. Unfortunately, Daniel's brother had died, and Daniel moved, I believe, and so Euler, somehow the position opened up, and now finally Euler was, at 24 years old, at only 24, he was a professor. Before that, he was like a visiting assistant, something like that. So, generally, you have the prof and then the undergrad. That's the hierarchy of the academic pyramid there. So he made it. Started at the bottom, now he's there. 24 years old, that's ridiculously young. So now he's established himself with a good career, a good research publishing record. He's in a career that he has a passion for. All that's left is to get married. So he does. And he marries the daughter of a famous Swiss painter. Her name is Katharina Giselle. So, Giselle, G-S-E-L. And she's got longer arms than he does to fit down into his deep pockets, I guess. But they had, let's see, so they get married, out pops 13 children. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. But unfortunately, only 5. This is crazy. Only 5 survive childhood, which it's really hard for us to think about that nowadays, but that was relatively common, you know, even for the well-to-do, like Euler kind of was. So, concerned about the continuing turmoil in Russia, there was always wars going on, a lot of political turmoil, even well before turmoil that is nearer to our present time of the revolutions, the Bolshevik revolutions of the early 20th century. There was turmoil. So he got up and moved back to Berlin. And here, at the Berlin Academy, he wrote something like, let's say, oh yeah, this is the fact I already read. 380 articles. In Berlin, he published the two works for which he would actually become most renowned. The Introductio, this was a work on functions and a work on calculus, etc., and many others, but those were one of his most famous. He was even elected foreign member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences based on his impeccable research. So, in addition, Euler was even asked to tutor Frederique Charlot of Brandenburg, Schwedt, the Princess of Anhalt-Dessau, and Frederick of Germany, I want to say, his niece. And interestingly enough, he wrote something like 200 letters to his student. And any other type of guy would have for sure thought there was some sexual love affair going on, but I genuinely think, because I'm a tutor myself, I understand that there's a really intellectually intimate relationship that you can develop that is very useful for obviously the student, but also for the tutor, because like Feynman and many other intellectuals have observed, you can only truly demonstrate mastery of a subject to yourself, among others, when you can explain it to a layman. And anyways, this book did phenomenally well. Out of all his math, it was a treatise on, as its title is aptly, if not so elegantly named, Letters of Euler on different subjects in natural philosophy. Natural philosophy. The full title is Letters of Euler on different subjects in natural philosophy, addressed to a German princess. German princess. And yeah, believe it or not, this book was the best-selling of all of his works. It contained his exposition on various subjects pertaining to physics and, of course, mathematics, as well as offering valuable insights into Euler's personal and religious beliefs. The book, it became more widely read than any of his mathematical works, which, who can blame the public? And to its credit, it was not only published all across Europe, but even in the States as well. So it was even powerful enough to penetrate the rough-shod ears of the pragmatic Americans of that time, the 1700s, pre-revolutionary America, mind you. So it's pretty interesting. The popularity of the letters testifies to his ability, like I said, to communicate scientific matters effectively to a lay audience, which is a rare ability for a dedicated research scientist. But in personal matters, interactions in debate, his gift of communication fell a little more flat. Euler was a simple, devoutly religious man, and he was actually, so he never really questioned. He was more of a conservative, traditional guy, and he never questioned the existing social order or conventional beliefs the way many enlightened thinkers and philosophers, even of that era, did. He was in many ways the polar opposite of another genius, Voltaire, a famous French philosopher who was himself actually, in his earlier years, very much derided and criticized, locked up in the Bastille, the famous French jail at the top of one of their towers, for his blasphemy towards both religion and the earthly kings. So Voltaire is a famous French Enlightenment writer, historian, philosopher, infamous for his wit and criticism of Christianity. So it was inevitable that Euler would, I'm going to say this. And I used the word ditto there. Sorry for that. So, I write this because I believe, almost like Euler might have been a genius in another life if he had dedicated himself to thoughts on how to act and how to live in the world, rather than how to mathematically manipulate objects. He probably thought the same about Voltaire. He would have been a genius if he had taken up the hard sciences, mathematics, logic. Although Voltaire was a deadly logician. But, regardless of Euler's personal preferences, there was a lot of things about his idiosyncratic character that just didn't quite gel with the powers that be. So he was, just because of his genius, he was allowed and invited into the king's court in Berlin when he was there teaching and researching, obviously. But ultimately, he didn't gel with the status quo. So he was ultimately kicked out. next is one of the last things we'll talk about regarding his life before we get into his works was his eyesight deterioration, which it kind of seems like an innocuous thing to draw attention to, but his eyesight was actually completely gone by the time he died. And in fact, many of his greatest papers in the latter half of his life were actually dictated to a scribe to write them down. So he was a powerful intellect, being able to, like Hawking in a lot of ways, do this in his head because he simply couldn't see to write. Euler's eyesight worsened throughout his mathematical career until in 1738, 3 years after nearly expiring from a fever, he became almost blind in his right eye. But Euler actually blamed the painstaking work on cartography he performed for the St. Petersburg Academy for his condition. He didn't blame the fever. Euler's vision in that eye worsened throughout this stay in Germany, and to the extent that Frederick referred to him, condescendingly of course, as the Cyclops. So poor Euler over here. I'm drawing everyone with long hair because that's just what people looked like back then. He actually wore quite a few of his portraits, which I didn't find many of, but he wore some type of tunic-looking thing. So maybe we'll just do that. But nonetheless, either way, he's still pretty happy about being able to pursue his passion and get paid for it. I'm sure. Yeah, he seemed like a humble guy, a very modest guy. He didn't blame anyone for his troubles, or at least, he blamed the prince for making him do cartography in Russia, but that didn't stop him from pursuing his passion. Famously actually commented that his lack of eyesight would lead to less distractions from his work. So he's a pretty hardcore guy. And then, if that wasn't enough, he later developed a cataract in his left eye that pretty much left him totally blind. So, like I said, however, his condition appeared to have little effect on his productivity. He compensated it with mental calculations. In his head, which is what mental means, of course, and an exceptional memory. For example, Euler could repeat he could repeat the Aeneid, the entire Aeneid of Virgil. Aeneid by Virgil. And he could even give you the page number if you recited a line from it. So with the aid of his scribes, Euler's productivity on many areas of study actually increased. He produced, on average, one genius level mathematical paper per week in the year 1775. And interestingly, Eulers, they might have had a predisposition in the entire family to eye problems, because later on, his lineage actually became known as Euler Schulpi. Obviously Euler, but Schulpi, C-S-C-H-O, oh, that kind of vowel, Schulpi, which means, it's derived, I guess, from the words Schelp and Schief, meaning squint or cross-eyed. So that's an unfortunate nickname to actually be assimilated into their surnames. So we've seen Euler, born in Switzerland, moved to St. Petersburg, moved back to Berlin, where he did much of his work. But then, after, in 1760, with the 7 Years' War raging, Euler's farm in Charlottenburg was ransacked by advancing Russian troops. Upon learning of this, the Empress Elizabeth of Russia, through the advice and the mutual respect of high-level generals for Euler in the Russian army, compensated him with a payment of 4,000 rubles, an exorbitant amount for that time. The political situation in Russia eventually stabilized after Catherine the Great's accession to the throne. So in 1766, Euler accepted an invitation to return back to St. Petersburg, and that is eventually where he died. So he was treated like nobility, given a 3,000 ruble annual salary, a pension for his wife, and the promise of high-ranking appointments for his sons. So this appeared to be a great circumstance, and it was for about the first 5 years of his stay back in St. Petersburg, until a great fire destroyed most of the city, including his home. And then 2 years later, he lost his wife, Katerina, after 40 years of marriage. So he kept it in the family, and 3 years later he married her half-sister, Salome Abigail, Giselle. And nicely, this marriage actually lasted all the way until he died, which was not until about 15 years after that. It was one evening. He was having lunch with his family. He was having lunch with his family and discussing the recently discovered planet Uranus. And he keeled over with a brain hemorrhage. So he was laid up. In bed, and unfortunately, only a couple hours later, he died. But he died doing what he loved best, having a deep discussion about the nature of the universe with a reverence for his belief in a creator and someone who allowed him the divine spark to access some of the more profound laws and realities that helped him understand and make sense of the world he lived in. I think it's best to wrap this up with a quote from the mathematician, the French mathematician and philosopher, Marquis de Condorcet, that said, "Il cessa de calculer et de vivre." He ceased to calculate and to live. So I appreciate you guys watching this. If you did all the way through, I don't know how well this is going to turn out. I was hoping to get through this, his biography, and his mathematics in one video, but I really don't think that's going to work out. So next time we'll have an opportunity to dive deep into his math and let's see and even some of his physics as well. And there we go. That's the number we call Euler's number, E. Just one of two numbers we named after Euler. So, yeah, I hope you are looking forward to that, and you know, I hope I did him some justice, because, you know, I've taken some upper level college math, so I understand, even from my limited perspective relative to mathematicians and physicists, his really deep, unique, genius contribution to just our general understanding of the world through mathematics. So, if you weren't too sure why I was choosing this guy, next time at least, other than just hearsay, you'll have a couple examples and a nice cameo by one of our good friends here at Let's Find Out to help us through the math of one of his most famous formulas, literally named after him. So we'll dive into that next time. Thanks for watching. Thanks for all your support and your feedback. It's really, really appreciated. It really is. So we'll see you guys in part 2. Bye.